President Trump is right. The strong dollar is hurting U.S. goods exports, data shows. Here's what he, the Fed, and the Treasury can do about it. Hello, this is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government, dailytorch.com. Hit that subscribe button. Today, we're going to be talking about the economy again, the strong U.S. dollar, and what that means for exports. Basically, the way the literature tells it, economic literature, the stronger the dollar is or a currency, the more expensive the exports of that country will be, and the cheaper the imports will be. Such that if you have a really strong dollar, you're going to be disadvantaging your own producers, your own manufacturers, farmers, anyone who does exports. And surely enough, if you look at the trade-weighted U.S. dollar index on broad goods, what you'll find is that it's at its highest levels that are seen on record, really. You have to go back to early 2000s to see the dollar this strong. And when you look at how that impacts U.S. exports, you definitely see a strong negative correlation between when the dollar is becoming more valuable, you see a commensurate drop in U.S. exports, and vice versa. When the dollar is really cheap, then U.S. exports tend to go up and to increase faster. In theory, then, a devaluation competitively versus foreign currency could actually help to boost U.S. exports, lessen the trade deficit, and grow the U.S. economy faster if there was enough of a cost advantage in doing so. The downside would be if there was domestic inflation that occurred as a result from the foreign goods. So this would make foreign goods more expensive. So there's an upside and there's a downside. And China engages in much the same shenanigans, if you want to call it that, on foreign exchange markets. It has trillions of dollars of U.S. dollar-denominated assets. And what it can do is buy dollars, and that will weaken, that'll make the dollar more expensive and weaken the yuan. And so that makes China's exports to the United States cheaper. It's kind of a beggar thy neighbor approach to economics and kind of mercantilism, but it's certainly nothing new. In the Great Depression, the same thing was going on, and these relationships are long established. Everyone's basically aware of them. Trump has been railing on the Federal Reserve that the dollar was too strong. On August 22nd, he says Germany sells 30-year bonds offering negative yields. Germany competes with the U.S. Our Federal Reserve does not allow us to do what we must do. They put us at a disadvantage against our competition. Strong dollar, no inflation. They move like quicksand. Fight or go home. So the president wants the Federal Reserve to be more active and to pay attention to exchange rates. And considering how the exchange rates can basically erode any policy that you try to implement to boost either exports or to attempt to bring more production back to the United States. The Federal Reserve can absolutely offset that just by making the dollar too strong, by refusing to purchase foreign currencies and to quarantine that. And so you see how strong the dollar has become. And you have to ask the question, is that the way the Fed wants it? Are they trying to offset Trump's trade policies? There was an op-ed in the Bloomberg opinion. The Fed shouldn't enable Trump. The central bank should refuse to play along with an economic disaster in the making. Bill Dudley, New York Fed, former New York Fed head president there, he thinks that the Federal Reserve should take into consideration what's going on with the 2020 election and do what it can to stop President Trump from implementing his policies, specifically his trade policies. So is the strong dollar a function of active measures by the Federal Reserve to make the dollar too strong so that it offsets what President Trump is doing on tariffs? Now, we're certainly not getting any help overseas either. China has devalued the yuan. It's at about 7.14 yuan per dollar right now. Other countries like Europe have also engaged in devaluation since the 2010s. You've seen a really sharp devaluation by the euro, by the European Central Bank, and that's obviously boosting their exports. China is boosting its exports. They're trying to offset what Trump is doing. And then if you look at the dollar index, it's hard not to come to the conclusion that perhaps the Fed, via its own open market operations, could be helping to make the dollar stronger to offset it. None of this is in U.S. interests. I think that it actually harms U.S. exporters and basically benefits foreign businesses and foreign countries like Europe, like China. And it's disadvantaging the American people. It's hollowing out our economy. We've been doing this for years. Starting in the 1990s, the dollar has been really, really strong relative to other currencies, and we have to start to ask the question why and what could be done to make it a little less valuable. Just as you could have a dollar that's too weak and then you'll get inflation. If the dollar's too strong, you could get deflation. Our monetary policy focuses on price stability, and I think with dollar index trade weighted as high as it is, that we're not going to be able to do that. This is not price stability. This is the opposite. I think that we could be doing much better with exports and everything else right now, and the economy growing, if the dollar was not so strong. Now, since at least October of 2018, President Trump has been calling for the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates. He says, I don't know, I'm just saying this. I'm very unhappy with the Fed because Obama had zero interest rates and I have almost normalized, or maybe normalized depending on who you're talking to, interest rates. You give me zero interest rates and you show me my numbers with zero interest rates. He had phony numbers because it was based on zero interest. Well, he had zero interest. So President Trump thinks that the Fed could do more to weaken the dollar, and I agree. I think that the one instrument for doing that is the federal funds rate. And right now, I mean, the federal funds rate is so high, it's actually inverted with the 10-year Treasury. That's a short-term, the shortest rate there is in terms of maturity versus a 10-year. This is you see the Fed will invert with Treasury bonds like the 10-year prior to a recession. But it doesn't have to. I think that the Fed could actually be cutting rates right now. The spread right now is only 0.6. So if you went down a full percentage point on the federal funds rate from 2% to 2.25, then you could actually go down to 1 to 1.25. And you would cure the inversion, and I think that would weaken the dollar. And any potential downturn that's on the horizon, I think you could forestall it, avert it for a couple of years at least, depending on how things go and other factors that come into play. So the Fed has an inverted rate. It could be acting to cure it, but in July it didn't do so. It only went down 0.25%. I mean, that's not enough to cure the inversion right now. But the fact is they did cut their rate at the July meeting. So there is some broad agreement that the rates are too high in absolute terms and that the dollar is too strong, therefore. Trump has been making that case for months, perhaps mindful of the historical data showing that when U.S. monetary policy is too strong relative to other currencies, it's often followed by slowdowns or, in extreme cases, recessions. And I think that you can see a strong dollar. And since the 90s, it's really this dollar index on a trade weighted basis has been relatively above 100. I think that indicates that we've had a strong dollar policy in this modern NAFTA and WTO era, and that is designed explicitly to drive exports from overseas to the United States and to weaken our exporters to countries overseas. It makes it too expensive to do business in the United States. We think of inflation and weak dollars usually as kind of like this tax on consumers. And that can certainly be true in the 1970s. But the way it's working here, this is a tax on American businesses. This is a tax on our ability to compete with the rest of the world. I think there's a happy medium there. I think the dollar is too strong right now. I think it could get too weak, but that's not, we're calling for something relatively weaker compared to how strong it is right now. These could be deflationary in nature. I think that there's a danger of pushing the dollar too strong, and then you wind up in a situation like the Great Depression, where the other countries, when the UK was coming off of the gold standard, it basically encouraged other countries to come off of the gold standard too, because they were able to boost exports. Here you see Britain's departure from the gold standard in 1931 is taking as a signal of the beginning of the devaluation cycle of the 1930s. And during this time, unemployment in the United States was rising dramatically. And we didn't come off of the gold standard, the interwar gold standard, until 1933. And it was only then that that you had a lessening of the deflation. Inflation was restored basically, and the unemployment rate began coming down. In all cases of this is Barry Eichengreen and Jeffrey Sachs. We've discussed this paper before. In all cases of unilateral devaluation, currency depreciation increases output and employment in the devaluing country. By raising the price of imports relative to domestic goods, depreciation switches expenditure towards domestic goods. So you boost domestic consumption of your own goods, and you can boost exports as well, and you can help with boosting employment in your home country. And so people did that back in the 30s. Exchange rates matter a great deal to trade flows and to whether there's inflation or deflation. If your currency gets too strong, you better watch out. The last time we had strong deflation in the United States was during the Depression. You also saw some during the Great Recession, and housing prices were collapsing. But in the Great Depression, you saw record high unemployment, and we never want to see that happen again, I think, in the United States. So we have to be careful. I think that we're in danger of that. And the Fed is acting politically, I think. I think that you could make an argument that the Fed kept interest rates too low for too long. If you were going to end the business cycle, they could have done it back during the Obama administration. But as Trump noted, complaining about it, that Obama had zero rates the entire time. And so you never saw this inversion of the federal funds rate in the 10-year Treasury. The 10-year, 2-year Treasury yield spreads have inverted. The 10-year, 3-month. And so these are all recession indicators. And so you can ask the question, I think legitimately, whether or not, especially based upon this former New York Fed president saying that they should hurt the economy, the Federal Reserve, to get rid of President Trump in 2020. I think that's a serious threat. President Trump should be paying attention to that. And, he's actually not powerless to work on the dollar and to weaken the dollar. There's the Exchange Stabilization Fund at the U.S. Treasury. And this is absolutely a tool for, it's what it's for, actually. The Exchange Stabilization Fund consists of 3 types of assets: U.S. dollars, foreign currencies, and special drawing rights, which is from the IMF. International Monetary Fund. And the ESF, the Exchange Stabilization Fund, can be used to purchase or sell foreign currencies, to hold foreign exchange and special drawing rights assets, and to provide financing to foreign governments. All operations require the explicit authorization of the U.S. Treasury Secretary. And so basically the idea is to act to stabilize the dollar if it's getting too weak or too strong on foreign exchange markets. And so this is actually something that the Treasury can do under the law, and they can actually work to stabilize it. Matt Phillips in the New York Times actually wrote about how these exchange stabilization funds work. He notes that, quote, "The People's Bank of China has the ability to print renminbi to weaken the currency if the exchange rate gets too high. On the flip side, Beijing has $3 trillion of reserves it can deploy to keep the currency from getting too weak." So right now, the United States doesn't operate that way. We do have some capacity in financial markets by using the Exchange Stabilization Fund, a vehicle that right now has about $100 billion of assets. And in the latest statement, it was actually $93.7 billion. Matt Phillips actually quotes President Trump saying that he could do it in 2 seconds. I didn't say that it's not something we're going to do. Joseph Gagnon, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, thinks that unless Congress gives Treasury the authority to beef up the ESF, quote, it just doesn't have enough firepower. So he thinks $100 billion is not enough to begin working on foreign exchange markets to try to devalue the dollar. But the Fed actually has unlimited firepower to do this. According to an August 21 report from the Congressional Research Service, U.S. dollar intervention, options, and issues for Congress. This is a very interesting paper from the Congressional Research Service. I think this is actually very useful, and it provides President Trump and the U.S. Treasury with a blueprint of what they could be doing to basically weaken the dollar if necessary, if it's deemed to be too strong. And I think that the Fed, can, according to the paper, could also purchase foreign currencies to reduce the value of the dollar. But unlike the Treasury, it is not limited in how much it can purchase because the Fed controls the money supply. It has the option to create bank reserves as desired to purchase foreign currency. So the Fed could absolutely engineer a dollar devaluation. According to the paper, the Treasury can too. Congress allowed the ESF to remain under Treasury outside of annual appropriations. Instead, the ESF retains all of the earnings from its operations. The main limitation to its ability to intervene is based upon the amount of dollar-denominated assets in its portfolio, which were $22 billion as of March 2019. In order to secure more dollars, the Treasury could seek additional appropriations from Congress. It could monetize its holdings of IMF special drawing rights, or it could, quote, engage in a currency swap arrangement called warehousing, in which the ESF sells foreign currency to the Fed and agrees to repurchase it at a later date, during which the Fed credits dollars reserves to the ESF for the duration of the swap. There have been articles written about this, warehousing, and a historical lesson in central bank independence. This is from the Cleveland Fed. And they kind of speak negatively of warehousing and instances where it's occurred in the 70s, the 80s, and also in the 1990s. There was this warehousing going on when there were attempts to I guess in these cases, you could devalue the dollar by depositing foreign exchanges with the Federal Reserve and taking them out of circulation. In fact, the Federal Reserve authorized warehousing to continue, and they periodically reauthorized this. So Treasury Secretary Mnuchin could actually go to the Federal Reserve and say, we'd like to deposit some foreign currencies with the Federal Reserve, and we'll buy them back later. Quote, the committee authorizes the bank to, with the prior approval of the subcommittee and at the request of the United States Treasury, to conduct swap transactions with the United States Exchange Stabilization Fund, established by Section 10 of the Gold Reserve Act of 1934, under agreements in which the selected bank purchases foreign currencies from the from the Exchange Stabilization Fund, and the Exchange Stabilization Fund repurchases the foreign currencies from the selected bank at a later date. Such purchases and sales are known as warehousing. So there's a way that the president could direct the Treasury Secretary to do this, to deposit the foreign currencies on account at the Fed. And this could actually help to boost U.S. exports and to actually make the dollar work for President Trump and make his policy vis-a-vis trade with China and the negotiations successful. The Federal Reserve could absolutely be helping. The Treasury can do something too. Congress could get involved. They could boost the funding, or how the the Treasury could access the Fed. In terms of depositing this warehousing. You could expand warehousing as well. And then the president would have the ability to engineer a devaluation to stabilize the dollar. Assuming the Fed is asleep at the wheel, Congress could act. And the Fed has already authorized this in 2017. And I'll leave you with the close here. Time is a major factor. If the dollar index shows anything, it is that it is very much subject to volatility, and its current strength is a direct result of competitive devaluations overseas. And it's also a function of the Fed's refusal, I think, to take foreign currencies out of circulation. They could absolutely do that, and they could be gobbling up yuan if to take that off of foreign exchange markets. We could be buying euros to take them off of foreign exchange markets, and the Fed could do this in a really robust manner. So time's a factor, though. How much time until the next recession? And how is that going to impact trade negotiations with China? Clearly, members of the Federal Reserve and former members of the Fed want to disrupt the president's trade negotiations with China and to make him lose the 2020 election. I think that the president should be considering all options being on the table. That's what he said. I could do it in 2 seconds if I wanted to devalue the dollar. I didn't say it. It's not something I'm not going to do. That all options are on the table, according to President Trump, and that's the way it should be. Price stability, particularly of exports, is impacted greatly by exchange rates, and yet the Fed fails to consider exchange rates in the conduct of monetary policy. Why? Arrangements are already in place to prevent this sort of thing from happening. President Trump is watching the manufacturing index fall, and he knows that the strong dollar is the reason for it. Now, when you hear or read about his latest complaint about the Fed, you will understand that it is their strong dollar policy which is blocking President Trump's ability to drive to restore manufacturing in the United States by boosting exports. Our nation is in an economic war, and it is time for the Federal Reserve to join the fight. That's the commentary. This is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government, dailytorch.com. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell for notifications, and have a good day.